The night of the highly anticipated Von Eer Enterprises annual gala unfolded with an air of sheer opulence. Set in the heart of Paris, the event took place at the prestigious Leg Grd Palais, where the grand ballroom seemed to shimmer with extravagance. The high, vaulted ceilings were adorned with intricate gold moldings, and chandeliers hung like clusters of brilliant constellations, casting a soft, ethereal glow over the room. Von Eer Enterprises had rented the space exclusively for the evening, transforming it into a luxurious haven for their distinguished guests. Each attendee, impeccably dressed in the finest Parisian fashion, mingled in a haze of sparkling wine and the hum of high-stakes business talk. Among the crowd stood Alexander von Eer, a 34-year-old mid-level financial analyst at his own family's company, adjusting his bow tie with increasing restlessness. Though it was a noteworthy achievement to be present at such an event, it was far from where he saw himself in the grand scheme of things. Known for his methodical, reserved demeanor, Alexander adhered strictly to tradition and protocol, often retreating into the shadows of the glittering world that surrounded him. His tall frame and dark hair, which was beginning to thin at the crown, were his most prominent features, though he made it a point to stay in shape, especially considering his wife, Isabella, frequently moved within circles far more affluent and influential than his own. Isabella, at 30, was everything Alexander admired, striking, confident, and effortlessly glamorous. With auburn hair that cascaded gracefully over her shoulders and captivating green eyes, she had risen rapidly within Von Eer Enterprises, carving a name for herself as a brilliant marketing executive. While Alexander felt like a shadow of her radiance, Isabella thrived in the high society gatherings, drawing admiring glances from every corner. Tonight, she wore a sleek black gown that clung to her figure and commanded the attention of everyone in the room. Yet, despite her polished exterior, Alexander could sense a subtle shift in her demeanor, a restlessness that unsettled him. It was as though the magic that had once sparkled between them had dimmed in the wake of their busy and often disconnected lives. Their marriage, once brimming with excitement, now seemed worn thin. Isabella's frequent late nights, punctuated by vague mentions of business dinners and late meetings, left Alexander questioning where he fit into her world. Still, he trusted her, perhaps too blindly. A gnawing sense of unease had begun to fester, an unease that tonight, in the midst of this glittering gala, felt sharper than ever. As they weaved through the crowd, exchanging pleasantries with peers and clients, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling of being an outsider in the world Isabella inhabited. Across the room, Maximilian Forer, the imposing 45-year-old CEO of a rival company, commanded the attention of everyone in his vicinity. With a regal presence, he was a striking figure, tall, with a muscular build that complemented his expensive tuxedo and air of self-assured authority. Known for his cutthroat business tactics and charming yet calculating demeanor, Maximilian was a man of power and influence. His allure was undeniable, especially to women, who were drawn to him like moths to a flame. Alexander's gaze flickered uneasily over to Isabella, who, much to his discomfort, was stealing glances in Maximilian's direction. There was something different in the way her eyes lingered on him tonight, something that made Alexander's stomach churn. "Darling, are you all right?" Alexander's voice was low, his concern genuine, as he leaned closer to Isabella by the champagne table. Isabella snapped out of her reverie, quickly forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Of course, what would there be?" she replied lightly, her voice masking the tension he could feel simmering beneath the surface. "It's just work. These gatherings are draining. Always needing to make an impression. Always putting on a show." Though he nodded, Alexander couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was more to it. Before he could inquire further, a voice, smooth and confident, cut through the conversation. Well, Alexander, thank you for the invitation. The event is truly magnificent." Maximilian's voice rang out as he approached, his presence commanding attention. He barely spared a glance for Alexander, his gaze fixed entirely on Isabella. "Ah, Isabella, you look stunning as always," Maximilian remarked, his words dripping with admiration. Isabella blushed under his gaze, her cheeks flushing in a way that made Alexander's grip tighten around his champagne glass. There was a familiarity between them that stung, a connection that seemed far too close for comfort. "Too kind, Mr. Von Eer," Isabella responded, her voice soft and laced with an undercurrent of tension that Alexander hadn't heard before. Maximilian took a deliberate sip from his glass, never breaking eye contact with Isabella. "I must borrow her for a moment, Alexander," he said, his tone leaving no room for refusal. It was more of a command than a request. Despite his growing discomfort, Alexander hesitated, unsure of how to respond. Before he could voice his objections, Isabella's soft touch on his arm stopped him. "It's just a quick chat," she said, her smile reassuring but hollow. "I'll be back soon." And just like that, she was gone, swept away by Maximilian's magnetic pull. Alexander watched them disappear into the crowd, the CEO leaning in close to speak to Isabella, far too close for Alexander's comfort. Alone now, surrounded by the whispers of the elite and the clinking of glasses, Alexander felt increasingly out of place. His mind raced. Was this merely a business conversation, or was there something more between them? His trust in Isabella, once unwavering, now felt fragile, splintered by the unease that had slowly crept into their relationship. As the night wore on, Isabella eventually returned to his side, but she was distant, her mind seemingly elsewhere. They exchanged pleasantries with other guests, but the connection between them had frayed, as though a rope that once bound them together was now on the verge of snapping. The gala continued, a blur of laughter, sparkling glasses, and the shimmering glow of chandeliers, but Alexander's mind was consumed by Maximilian's lingering presence, the way Isabella had responded to him, and the growing sense of detachment that now hovered between them. When the evening finally drew to a close, the ballroom began to empty as guests said their farewells and dispersed into the cool Parisian night. Alexander and Isabella made their way back to their apartment in the elegant Marais district. The cozy space they had once chosen as a symbol of their bright future now felt strangely cold and empty. Isabella, exhausted, retired to the bedroom without a word, leaving Alexander alone in the living room, his thoughts swirling. Sitting by the window, gazing out at the distant twinkling lights of the Eiffel Tower, the events of the evening played over and over in his mind. The way Maximilian had interacted with Isabella. The way she had responded. The tension that hung in the air between them. Unable to shake his discomfort, Alexander silently walked down the hallway toward their bedroom, the weight of his thoughts growing heavier with each step. The quiet night in their apartment was shattered only by the soft creak of the bedroom door as Alexander entered, his heart pounding with uncertainty. He gazed across the room, where Isabella lay in bed, her back turned to him, only her shoulders visible beneath the covers. The sight of her, so still, so distant, struck him like a cold wave. For a moment, he thought of remaining silent, letting the questions churn in his mind without speaking them aloud. But the words slipped out before he could stop them. Isabella. His voice was soft, almost hesitant, yet it cut through the tension in the room. She didn't respond. She didn't even stir. Isabella. He tried again, his voice cracking with a mix of vulnerability and frustration. This time, she shifted slightly, but her back remained to him, her face hidden in the shadows. There was no answer, only the faint sound of her breathing. He stood at the edge of the bed, his chest tight with dread. "What's the matter, Isabella?" he asked, his heart pounding louder than his words. Her response was slow, almost reluctant. She sat up in bed, turning to face him, her expression troubled. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander took a deep breath, the question burning in him, desperate to be spoken. "Is there something going on between you and Maximilian?" The words hung in the air between them, a heavy cloud of uncertainty and suspicion. The room seemed to shrink around him, the weight of his own doubts suffocating him. Isabella hesitated. She looked away for a moment, her eyes shadowed with something he couldn't place. Then, she slowly turned her gaze back to him, her eyes narrowing with a touch of frustration. "Alexander, you're overthinking this," she replied, her voice edged with defensiveness. "Maximilian is just my boss. Nothing more. Is that really all?" Alexander interjected, his voice rising despite his efforts to remain composed. The bitterness in his words was unmistakable, a reflection of the months of growing tension between them. "From my perspective, it hasn't seemed that way for a while now." Isabella's face softened, but only briefly, as though she was searching for the right words. She hesitated before speaking again, her voice carefully measured. "You're overthinking it, Alexander. Yes, Maximilian and I are close, but it's strictly professional. We spend a lot of time together because of work, but that's all there is to it." Her words, though intended to calm him, did nothing to quell the storm raging inside him. He felt the slight tremor in her voice, the faintest hint of hesitation that made him question everything. "Don't deceive me, Isabella," he snapped, his frustration spilling over. His tone grew more urgent, more forceful. "I deserve the truth." For a long moment, she didn't say anything. She simply stared at him, her green eyes filled with a mix of regret and something darker. Guilt perhaps, or resignation. Finally she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry, Alexander." The words hit him like a physical blow. His breath caught in his throat as the weight of the truth crashed over him. Despite all his suspicions, despite the unease that had gnawed at him for weeks, hearing her admit it, hearing her confirm what he had feared most, shattered him. His heart seemed to fracture in 1,000 places, each shard piercing deeper than the last. "How long?" he whispered, barely able to form the question, his voice broken and raw. Isabella lowered her gaze to her hands, unable to meet his eyes. Her silence spoke volumes, but it was the quiet confession that followed that truly tore him apart. "A few years," she said softly, her voice trailing off as she spoke the words that sealed the final blow. At first, it had seemed like a mistake, a single lapse in judgment, but now it felt like the very foundation of their relationship was crumbling beneath him. Alexander stood frozen, the ground beneath him suddenly shifting, tilting dangerously. The woman he had loved, the woman he had built his life with, had betrayed him, not once but for years. And he had been kept in the dark, blissfully unaware of the secret that had festered between them all this time. His chest tightened, and tears threatened to spill from his eyes, but he fought to hold them back. "How could you do this to me?" His voice cracked with emotion, a mixture of hurt and disbelief. "How could you toss away everything we worked so hard for?" Isabella's gaze met his, and for the first time that evening, he saw the truth reflected in her eyes. Her own eyes glistened with unshed tears, a reflection of the pain she had caused him. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Maximilian. He's influential, and I got swept up in it. I never meant to hurt you, Alexander. I never wanted to." But the words felt hollow. The apology, though sincere, couldn't undo the damage that had already been done. The pain she had caused him ran deeper than she could ever understand, deeper than she could ever fathom. In the weeks that followed, Alexander was consumed by a whirlwind of anguish, rage, and confusion. He packed his bags and initiated divorce proceedings, unable to stay under the same roof as the woman who had chosen another man over him. The finality of the divorce was swift, a cruel punctuation mark at the end of their once promising future. And after it was done, Alexander never saw Isabella again. As he began the long and painful process of rebuilding his life, piece by piece, something unexpected happened. He found a sense of freedom in walking away, in severing the ties that had bound him to a life of quiet suffocation. In a way, he had won. He had taken control of his future, despite the betrayal that had threatened to destroy him. Maximilian may have deemed him insignificant, but Alexander discovered that there was something more valuable than revenge. There was the freedom to live without the weight of deception on his shoulders. Isabella, on the other hand, couldn't shake the nagging feeling that perhaps in leaving, Alexander had claimed the one victory that truly mattered, the victory of choice, the victory of freedom. For her, the decision to walk away was one she had come to regret. But Alexander's decision to leave, to reclaim his life, was a victory she couldn't deny.